Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. He is Mike Niziolek, Bloomington Herald-Times. It is just before 9 a.m. on Saturday, November 16th, 2024. This is a Mind Your Banners Live and Mind Your Banners Special. I don't know what we're calling this. Mind Your Banners Reaction Show. Mike, I think we might need to change the name of the podcast. I think we need to either that or we need to get some banners in Memorial Stadium, one of the two. Because I think it's time to stop. I think it's time to stop branding this as a basketball-specific podcast. We keep talking about football, and this morning, even though it's the bye week, we have big news out of Bloomington. Curt Cignetti agrees a new 8-year contract, average annual value of $8 million, a guaranteed annual retention bonus of $1 million. This will make him one of the highest paid. We don't have year-by-year compensation breakdowns yet, but this will almost certainly make him one of the highest paid coaches in the Big Ten and the highest paid IU employee ever. And I think from Indiana fans' perspectives, the big hook is Curt Cignetti is locking into Indiana long term. Obviously, this is what fans have wanted to hear for a while, and it is a big step for IU.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of if it's $8 million per year, that puts them, per the USA Today coaches database, fifth in the Big Ten, which is very high up, behind only Lincoln Riley, Ryan Day, James Franklin, and Dan Lanning. I think he comes about 16th nationally. I mean, so those are huge numbers in terms of, what this does for him. I mean, obviously not all the details yet, but just kind of the general structure. I mean, it just represents, obviously, I think you wrote about this, a huge commitment to football, not just to Curt Cignetti, but to football in general, when you're paying your head coach $8 million a year.
Yeah, and I think so. I guess the technical details quickly. Normally, the way these things work, and we don't have the full details of Cignetti's contract yet. I imagine we'll get those in the next few days in terms of what buyouts. I think you and I both were able to confirm, at least generally, that there's an expectation of substantially boosted resources around things like assistant coaching salary pools. Which is going to be one of those things that I think was probably as important to Cignetti as his own compensation in a lot of ways. The way these things tend to work, like from a compensation perspective, is like it's an 8-year contract, so it'll start at something like $7.5 million, and then he'll get a built-in $100,000 raise every year until it gets to $8.5 million. But in the same way you do with baseball contracts, you'll average that out and you'll say the average annual value is $8 million. But I mean, with the $1 million retention bonus, I would be shocked, for example, if Curt Cignetti is not making north of $8 million next season. That's obviously a substantially higher number than anything Indiana's paid, not just a football coach, but a basketball coach. Again, we'll wait to see in particular what the sort of infrastructural support he's received, the guarantees he's received contractually are. But I would be surprised if there's not a significantly expanded pool for retaining his assistants, which I think is going to be equally important. Not that, Indiana staff should stay together forever and never change. But, if you're Curt Cignetti, it's clear that part of what makes this work is his ability to find people who fit his work process, who fit his scheme, who think about football the same way. And really kind of just keep those people around him and keep growing with them. And I think that's going to be an important piece of this too.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's talked about the assistant coach part of it since he took over. I mean, obviously, I think you can see the loyalty he's built within his staff. Brian Haynes has been, I think, with him the longest out of the current staff members. Does that sound right?
I think Shanahan, because Haynes was with him and then left. I think Shanahan's been with him continuously since the IUP days.
Okay,
but those two go further back with him than anybody else on staff.
Yeah, and so obviously, Tino, I think, is going to get interest, and he's been kind of a big part of the success. Obviously, working with the quarterbacks, which is a big part of what they're doing here. I think it ensures. I think what Curt Cignetti wants to ensure is that there's nobody's going to make a lateral move on the staff. If there's a raise, if there's a head coaching position, or Tino gets an offensive coordinator offer, something like that, there's not much you could do. But in terms of another school just looking to hire them at the same position, you want to prevent that from happening. And this will probably do that in terms of he'll have the ability to offer obviously raises at the end of the season, and then lock up guys to keep them in case guys come sniffing around.
Yeah, I'm trying to do the math here because somebody asked what the total assistant salary pool was, or what we think it'll be. I'm doing the math and like really quickly, I think Indiana was somewhere in the range of about $7 million that it was paying its assistants. Brian Haynes was already making over $1 million in guaranteed compensation. Mike Shanahan was at $800,000 in annual guaranteed compensation. I think your point is a really valid one. When somebody said like gut check, Joel Knows said, where do you think salary pool ends up? I think it was already at about 7. I wouldn't be surprised if it's pushing closer to 10 now. And I think you're not going to keep everybody. Like you said, like if Tino Sinceri gets an offensive coordinator offer, or if, Mike Shanahan might be at some point soon positioning himself to either, consider a really, really big offensive coordinator job, or maybe even to try and go run his own program somewhere. He's had he's a young guy, but he's had a ton of success where he's been. You're not going to keep everybody forever, but I think your point is really valid. It's about saying when Indiana wants a guy, they're not going to lose him to Oklahoma State. They're not going to lose him to West Virginia. They're not going to lose him to Vanderbilt, or even probably to some extent like let's say an Ole Miss or someplace like that. That Indiana is at least going to be able to be competitive at a really high level to keep guys, as long as they aren't obviously making a significant step up in terms of opportunity, to keep the assistants that Cignetti wants on his staff around.
Yeah, and and this allows him, obviously, if he does have to replace somebody, to I think they're I was looking up the Mike Shanahan and Brian Haynes bio. I think it's like total years is the same, but like you said, Shanahan's consecutive. But that neither here nor there. But then it allows him to hire somebody that he wants, and there's no self-imposed limitations on who he wants to bring in if he has to replace somebody.
So that tomorrow does not have to. Tomorrow no longer has to be a concept, is what you're saying.
Well, when you're making $8 million, you probably don't want it to be. This is everything Indiana fans wanted. I think they're obviously waking up today pleased. I had some fans that still followed me from my Virginia Tech days being like, be careful what you ask for. They remember locking up Justin Fuente after he was a hot name with an extension. And the buyouts have been kind of an albatross for programs. I'm interested to see that detail, not that they'll have to take advantage of it, but just in terms of these schools that have been burned, how do they work that, and how do they balance sort of like wanting to make it a financial penalty, but also not wanting to have to pay $15 million again just in case something happens. But that's a detail that we'll find out later. Just because you've seen these astronomical sums in recent years.
And listen, it's interesting. We had Stephen Godfrey on the podcast.
What's this we? There's no we there.
Well, we being the Mind Your Banners staff, Mind Your Banners Brain Trust, Mind Your Banners Board of Regents. And Stephen, we didn't talk much about it, but Stephen spends a lot of time, particularly well-sourced in the coaching carousel world. It's moving very slowly right now. And the reason why is because you have all these big buyouts, and right now schools are having to clear these revenue sharing holes. And the schools like Indiana, schools in the Big Ten, schools in the SEC are having to continue to make sure they fully fund their NIL efforts as well. And you basically are just saying, we can't do both. We can't buy out, a coach on a $35 million buyout and then also manage this stuff over here. That doesn't mean, though, I don't think that Indiana wasn't right to move on Cignetti. And I think that the metaphor that has kind of come to mind for me is like, Indiana's acted like a carnivore here in the ecosystem, in the sense that, like, for a long time, Indiana football obviously was not, at a very high, very high up on the quote unquote food chain. It's still not at the Ohio State level or the Georgia level or whatever, but any school in the Big Ten or the SEC is now, substantially ahead of any school that's not. Even schools in the ACC, even Miami, even, schools in the Big 12. I don't even know, like, what are the best schools in the Big 12 right now, like, in terms of, like, football prestige. I don't know. Kansas State, maybe, BYU. And this is Indiana seeing the success that a head coach had, that I think it had a lot of confidence in to begin with. Like, I wrote this morning. There's an extent to which I think Scott Dolson almost began the process of extending Curt Cignetti the day he hired him. That's how much Dolson and Pam Whitten believed in Cignetti. But this is also Indiana moving very proactively to say there is someone here with a vision. Like, you mentioned Justin Fuente. Someone in my mentions compared it to Mel Tucker. But I think the massive difference is Mel Tucker had limited success as a head coach.
There's two massive differences how those things ended.
Yes. But I'm talking about the extension. Let's be fair. Talking about the extension specifically, we're going to leave the other thing to one side. Mel Tucker had limited success as a head coach before one really, really good season at Michigan State. Curt Cignetti has now won 129 games in 14 seasons as a head coach. And yes, this is his first year at the Big Ten level, but Indiana was looking for somebody that had not just the coaching chops, but the vision to try and push this program to a more serious place in the most important and financially lucrative sport in all of college athletics. It got that person. This is Indiana being very intentional and sort of aggressive about keeping that person in place.
Yeah, that's I think what I point out about Fuente too is that you're talking about a person with a much longer track record, never had a losing season, has built winning structures at multiple programs, not just, a flash in the pan in terms of, he had success at one spot and then just that carried over. And, he's had success even going back to his assistant days. He was well thought of in terms of an offensive mind and things like that. You were asking about the Big 12, the two highest paid coaches in the Big 12. Do you want to take a stab?
Campbell, one of them? I bet Campbell's one of them. No, really?
There's a really obvious one.
Well, one is Gundy, probably.
Yeah, right? Gundy's the highest.
And then is it Kansas State?
Lance Leopold.
Oh, that's right. Well, that's an interesting segue, though, because obviously Leopold, I know Kansas has not been quite as good this season, and probably that's
that might be the comparison, right? Because
that's maybe instructive to the idea that, hey, listen, even if you got a guy that's got it going at a good rate, like, there will always still be some tough years. But to use Leopold as an example, I mean, he took over Kansas. It was in, like, the worst imaginable position. It had spent so much bad money. It had, like, there was Charlie Weiss and then Les Miles. They had sunk so much resource into just bad decisions. He took Kansas over at the bottom in 2021. They went 2-10. Then his second year, they went 6-6 and lost the Liberty Bowl. Then last year, they won 9 games and won the Guaranteed Rate Bowl, which, who cares? It's a bowl in Phoenix. It's a bowl that, Indiana hasn't won a postseason game in 33 years. Like, it's a bowl. But, like, it's interesting that you talk about the parallels with Leopold, because something Kansas committed to when it signed Leopold to a new extension was a substantial renovation of its stadium. And we don't know the details on exactly what Indiana is exploring around Memorial Stadium yet. I had something. I think I had something from this week talking about how Pam Whitten and Scott Dolson are in both the planning and the financing stages. So, I mean, they're basically getting the money together to figure out just how wide the scope of the project can be. I would encourage anybody interested to go look at the details of that Kansas project, because I think there's some things in there that Indiana might be considering too. Like, for example, Kansas is building a sort of mixed use area around its stadium that is expected to, I think, include both some shops and some bars, restaurant type places. We've seen some professional franchises have success with that. Like I know, obviously, as a Braves fan, I go home. That whole area, the Battery around the Braves Stadium, is a huge economic boondoggle. I don't think anybody's going to be able to pull something like that off in a college town. But I think Indiana is considering the idea of more permanent structures that are fan-facing outside the stadium itself that could also generate revenue for, sort of the department long term. I'm not sure on that. I just think that may be kind of like what we're talking about. It's not just about replacing the pipes and the toilets, if you understand what I'm saying. It's worth saying that was already on the cards. Like, that has been a priority for Scott Dolson basically since the day he took the job. I think it got slowed down by COVID and all the sort of financial ramifications of that. But we know last year Indiana was surveying fans and season ticket holders and donors for what they'd like to see out of a Memorial Stadium upgrade. I think there are going to be some other things. I think the press box and the donor suite areas are going to get massive overhaul, if not replaced completely. All that stuff is not just specific to Curt Cignetti and keeping Curt Cignetti in Bloomington. But the Lance Leopold comparison, I think, is apt in that you're getting a coach who's staying in place in part because I think he sees the willingness to invest around football at a level that has never happened before, not just in his contract or even just in his assistants' contracts, but just the whole sort of picture of what IU football is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually talked to him I asked him, I got a chance to chat with him briefly on Thursday, I think it was. And I asked him, because I did a story for, it was online now, but it's A1 on Sunday, just kind of about the athletic department making the most of this moment. And one of the things he talked about, he wants everybody rowing together, and that he likened it back to that interview that he had with Scott, the first one, that he's like, look, if the commitment's there, he feels like, and he said this multiple times, that any Power 5 program in the country, like state school, can be successful with the necessary commitment. And it's not just resources for NIL. It's not just resources for assistance. It goes beyond that. It's the commitment. And so I think that he's seen that throughout, because I think, one thing he was frustrated, I think this goes back to the beginning of the season when he was frustrated about kind of the fan and the fan experience. Indiana has moved quickly to sort of address his concerns. And I think that speaks to all what we're talking about, that he sees he has a very global view of the program, and they're trying to sort of match, his, what he wants and trying to make it all work.
Stephen had another good line when we were talking, and we weren't talking about this specifically, but more about like the question of how IU builds on this. And he said Cignetti, he said like he studied under Nick Saban, he's going to start asking for things. And I liked that line, that like he's, you use the term like a global sort of perspective, like, Indiana's not just going to have to start writing blank checks for whatever.
Apparently, well, and so in that story, they meet Mondays, the athletic department, essentially with his director of operations, and he has a list of things on his mind or things that he wants addressed, and it goes down to wrote about the rally towels. That was even part of it. It was the idea that like the atmosphere is not good enough here. Like, we need to make some improvements. Because those first 2 weeks were eye-opening for him, and I think he wanted immediate changes, and you've kind of seen the turnaround, and that's it's all part and parcel of kind of getting him to agree to be here long term. That's what he wanted to see, and I think he's seen it, from the athletic department, and made him comfortable, sort of obviously making this commitment.
It is very Saban-esque. I mean, it really is. A couple people have asked about NIL here in the comments. Like that's one of those things where I don't know if the number is going to ever be publicly confirmable, but I would be surprised if that was not also part of this, at least in terms of private assurances that, that number, like my understanding, again, just to talk about things we've reported in the past, my understanding is Indiana was at about 1.5, 1.6, 1.8, something like that, like at the beginning of maybe I think probably sometime in like the summer of 23. It got up to about 3 million. We reported that during the coaching search. That was like the number Indiana took into the market when it was hiring Tom Allen's replacement. I believe Indiana has come close to and maybe even surpassed doubling that number since. And obviously, there's been quite a lot of energy around football. So those numbers, like my assessment of the numbers, may even be outdated at this point. I don't know if there's ever going to come a point where somebody is willing to just kind of publicly say this is what we're working with, because nobody really does that with NIL, because it is always such a movable feast. It's not something that's, at least right now, is funded with revenue. So it's not
also
something
not necessarily a annual number, right? Because
no, that's what I was about to say. It's not like in the NFL where you set a salary cap and everyone knows how much revenue they're getting distributed from, the TV contract, and then it's all about ticket sales and how much you have to spend, whatever. Like, NIL is still driven by donations. It cannot be funded by the athletics department. And I don't know that we're ever going to get to a place that it will be, because we're going straight to revenue sharing. That doesn't mean NIL goes away. It means NIL has to stay more of like a booster thing, basically. But I would be shocked if, assurances have not been made about, the number Cignetti has, which he's said many times. He feels like he has the NIL to compete. And I think it's worth saying too, once we do go to revenue sharing, I think number one, that suddenly provides a baseline, right? That NIL doesn't have to cover for basically every football player, probably. But then also number two, I think probably the other thing you will see is NIL collectives moving away from, really kind of trying to spread the wealth across the department. Like, I think collectives have tried to sort of obviously provide the funds for and the resources for your big money sports, but still touch on the really good, swimmer or tennis player, soccer player, softball player, whatever. I think there's going to be more of kind of a cultural recognition of revenue sharing is now the opportunity for those players. And with a few exceptions, all the NIL money is just going to flow more toward the money sports. And so that can help too. I would just be surprised if Indiana has not, been able to lock down NIL commitments that Curt Cignetti is comfortable with saying that's going to be enough for me to continue building a competitive roster year on year.
Yeah, and we had Joel in the comments asking about expectations moving forward. That's an interesting question, because the Big Ten schedule is harder next year. Non-conference schedules now. In terms of they're going to have to flip. He's going to have to flip the roster again. Probably need at least. I haven't added it up, but double-digit new starters at a minimum. I don't know if it's closer to 10 or 20, but quite a few. Fans okay with the 8 wins next year? Like, what do you think this does to sort of reset expectations as we sort of?
I think I think there is like a conversation to be had about just like, hey, listen, it's not going to be this way every year. Like, and that would have been true if Cignetti hadn't extended, whatever. Like, it's hard to go 10-0. Like, think about all the teams. It's funny when I talk to IU fans who say, like, do you think we can compete at this level forever? And I say, well, you got a coach that obviously has a proven track record of winning. But think about all the programs right now that are shouting and screaming about how Indiana shouldn't be ranked as high as it is in the college football playoff. They all have 1 and 2 losses. It's hard to go 10-0. Like, that's very difficult. Now, I think any place that's paying a coach, $8 million plus a year, if we include the retention bonus, and we don't know what other kind of, built-in compensation is there yet, whether it's in the form of guaranteed compensation or, performance incentives, bonuses, et cetera. But any coach that's making north of $8 million, like, you need to be at minimum going to bowl games every year, at minimum, competing to win your bowl games every year. You need to have a plan and a sort of
I get the fact that
process that makes you a consistent contender, at least at, like, I would say, like, the fringes of the playoff, at least at the, like, if you want, like, it's hard because obviously we're 10 years into the playoff era. We're in the first year of the 12-team playoff, But like if you want like historical analogs in the Big Ten, like what Indiana's always wanted to be is Wisconsin. Like Barry Alvarez is Wisconsin. And Wisconsin had precious little football history before Barry Alvarez got to Madison. And Barry Alvarez never won a national title at Wisconsin, but he went to the Rose Bowl a few times. He won a couple of Rose Bowls. And more broadly, every year, Wisconsin was a serious, just about every year, Wisconsin was a serious Big Ten football program that was a difficult out at home and had to be reckoned with basically anywhere it went. And I think that that is a reasonable expectation if this is the kind of resource you are going to be providing to your football program. Now, some of that probably has to be adjusted for, let's call it like, inflation. Like Barry Alvarez did not have to navigate an 18-team conference with unbalanced schedules and all that stuff. But I think that Indiana's goal has always been, at least in the most reductive terms, to be Wisconsin football. And I don't think that's unrealistic or unreasonable.
Yeah, and I would think that Cignetti's goals are a little bit higher in terms of like, you mentioned
self-imposed limitation.
No, it's self-imposed limitation, but in terms of like, I don't think he'd view a 6-win bowl game season as some fans have said in the comments that they'd be good if they make a bowl. I don't think he views that as sort of like the ultimate success. I think that would be disappointing. I think he wants them to compete for a big title sort of annually. Undefeated is obviously, and he said this on his radio show, like, I thought success was possible, but I don't think any coach would predict 10-0. Like that's beyond sort of the scope, right? There's only 4 unbeaten teams left in the country, 2 in the Big Ten. But I just think when you look at that schedule next year, especially 5 road games at Iowa, Oregon, and Penn State next year, this is not going to look the same. I mean, maybe it will. Maybe he's just that good. But there will be, in terms of probably a step back. Undefeated will be challenging.
The last thing I'd say, and then we'll wrap this up. I think Hoop said at the front end of the comments that in a weird, like one of the unintended benefits, or maybe intended, I don't know, of this was that it kept it puts IU back in the news cycle even during a bye week. It keeps IU football kind of at the front end of the slipstream or the news stream or whatever term you want to use. It is kind of a reminder, like, this is the cultural shift that Cignetti has wrought. We've talked about it, Big Noon in town, game day in town. I think there's a decent chance both will be in Columbus next week, to be honest with you. I know Big Noon's already committed to that. I wouldn't be shocked if game day is there too. They've gone to the same place before. I think they've gone to the same place this year. So this is just kind of like Indiana football is going to be one of the pregame headlines. In fact, I believe Cignetti is supposed to talk live, obviously remotely, to the game day set sometime around 11:40 today. So for people who
I think it's Big Noon, not game day, but
is it Big Noon? Okay, it's Big Noon. Sorry. Either way, the point is he's going to talk to one of the 2 big pregame shows about this. This is where Indiana football is right now, and this is, if you want to know like why Indiana is trying to seize this moment, why Indiana is being so aggressive. Scott Dolson, Pam Whitten, both central to this effort. It's because Indiana football is it's having a moment, and it's an earned moment. It's not something that just kind of came out of it did come out of nowhere maybe, but it's not something that is artificial. Like, Indiana deserves to be 10-0. Indiana is, I think, probably, we can never be sure, but I think probably doing the right thing in being aggressive with Curt Cignetti's new contract. And it's keeping Indiana very much in the sort of the forward consciousness of IU or of college football, I guess. And this program has fought for that for a long time. And now that you've got it, like, I know, like, if you think about, 11 months ago when it all kind of seemed a little bit like a novelty, and Curt Cignetti was up in Indianapolis saying, I'm getting a feel for the building because we'll be here next year for the Big Ten championship game and all that. But like, now a lot of that is becoming more real, and it's becoming more real, to your point, is what Cignetti said, faster than probably anyone would have expected. But that's where Indiana's going. And it's obviously really impressive to see, but I think it's really important and understandable for Indiana to want to be building on that from here.
Yeah, I mean, you're in the game of the year next week. You're in the playoff discussion. I mean, there's no reason to try to not take advantage. And you mentioned, the NIL of it all. I mean, those are things you can fundraise off of. When you have excitement and you have momentum, I think that's everything the departments wants. I mean, that's the perfect kind of case scenario to try to keep moving it forward. And I think Scott had a vision. We talk about Cignetti's blueprint for success, but I think Scott Dolson had a vision here that he's executed well and deserves credit. I think a lot of teams sort of passed over Cignetti throughout the years in terms of not giving him that chance, and Scott bought it. And so I think that he deserves credit too today for how this has all played out.
I think it's Scott Dolson. I think it is Pam Whitten as well. I think both of those, obviously Dolson took his job in 2020. Pam Whitten was appointed or confirmed. I don't know exactly what the language you use with the university president is, but in 2021, and they have both been really driven to get IU football moving in this direction, basically since assuming their respective posts. And I think it will be a day that they will both celebrate. We'll wrap it up here. Obviously, we'll be back from Assembly Hall with coverage of IU South Carolina. There is still a basketball game today. Yet again, basketball is overshadowed here on Mind Your Bowl posters by IU football. But he's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. HeraldTimesOnline.com, IndyStar.com/sports. We'll have more coverage from all of this here, obviously today and going forward. And as Mike pointed out just a minute ago, next week is a really, really big one for Indiana football. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, everyone who joined us live. We will obviously have our post-game live show after IU South Carolina too, so stay tuned for that, or maybe go do something else for a few hours and then come back. Don't just sit in front of the YouTube screen until 5:30. But we will both be back soon. Thank you for joining us. This has been Mind Your Banners live special.